There we go. So our first session is comparing 30-inch and 60-inch corn yields using cover crops. We have Mike Bellen from Bellen Farms. Bellen Farms is a generational farm family that operates to preserve and improve soils with the use of no-till, cover crops, and crop rotation as a priority, producing high-quality commodities while maintaining soil fertility and increasing soil organic matter of each acre. The Bellen Farm is located in Don Euphemia Township, near Oil Springs, Ontario in Lambton County. Mike has mostly brooks and clay loam soils. With his family, they produce corn, soybeans, and soft red winter wheat using 100% no-till since 1991, and they have been incorporating cover crops since 2014. I'll turn it over to Mike, and then I'll intro Adam after Mike.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yep, we can see you and hear you.
Okay, perfect. Nothing like the first go. Got to get the bugs worked out. Anyways, welcome, and I'm here to speak about our 60-inch corn trials that kind of intermingled. They were an add-on, I guess, or an addition to some other trials that we've been doing for the last couple of years. So it was in collaboration with SCRCA and the on-farm, and they're going to speak more too about what the other part of the trial was. I'm going to speak on my findings or my numbers, I guess, on my 60-inch corn trial. So this is where we farm, like Jessica, Lambton County, Don Euphemia. We are in a heavy clay loam area. We have been long-term no-till cover crops for at least 7 years. And then I've been just tinkering with the 60-inch corn for the last couple of years. So the first thing is, yes, you can go ahead and just try 60-inch corn, but you got to have a goal or a realization of why you're doing it. So some of that for us was, it started out as improving our living roots system. So trying to keep a living root 365 days a year. So part of that was interseeding corn on 30 inches and not getting a very good establishment with the interseeded cover crop. So that led us down the 60-inch corn path. Grazing opportunities, grazing some livestock on that interseeded corn stalks in the fall, and then the possibility of carbon sequestration and the future with that, if there is any, I guess. So just a few pictures of the progress throughout the season. Now this is 2020 corn crop, but it just gives you a good visual of of how bare the soil is in between the 60 inches, right? There's a lot of space there. So as I'll speak to it later on, one of the importances of that working with 60-inch corn is having the soil covered up, because that's one of the purposes that we don't want to defeat. So this is later on in the season. As you can see, we got a good establishment from our interseeded cover crop, and it does get some pretty good growth of some tillage radish. You can see up here in the front, you can see how green that row is. So annual ryegrass, crimson clover, and tillage radish is the mixture at about 12 pounds. Later on in the season, you can see that there is good establishment, cob establishment on the plant. And usually you would see 2 cobs at least per corn stalk, and 2 good viable cobs, sometimes 3. So some of the numbers here. So this is in conjunction with, like I said, the other trial that was part and parcel with the on-farm that Adam is going to speak more to, but just a generalization that the 60-inch corn took about a 25% yield reduction, okay, which was expected, as compared to the 30-inch. So just to get into some of that cost of production, these are just some rough numbers of just input costs. So as I break it down, this is the cost of production on 30-inch rows. Okay, and just take note that seeded at 34,500 population, starter package, our 28 nitrogen package, and then our chemical pass coming to $318 an acre for the basic 30-inch rows. Break that down a little bit further for the 60-inch rows. Now, when it was planted, all we did was shut every other row off, so we didn't increase the population in the 60-inch rows. So essentially, you're getting half the population per acre. Okay, so I just I took half of that for our starter and our nitrogen package, so we're using half the amount of nitrogen, keeping the same chemical number because you're gonna apply a broad acre spray program. So that breaks down to $170 an acre for 70-inch corn on a half the population as a 30-inch. So that was one of the questions, was can we achieve more with less inputs or cost of production, right? So the 30-inch gave a $52 an acre advantage. So you can see the net there on just the input package, right? So can the $52 be made back with grazing, some type of carbon market, or just knowing that it's a long-term soil health benefit by having a living root 365 days a year with a good interseed package? And maybe there can be some reduction here with the seed. Maybe we can lower our seeding costs, okay, to take away some of that $52 an acre. Some more in season, you can see this is the 30-inch row. You can see the limited sunlight for the establishment of cover crop. You really have the interseeded cover crop. You really have to get it off to a good start. Versus the 60-inch, you can see the sunlight advantage here and the better establishment. These are side by side here. So thoughts to consider as I put this together. If continuing with the 60-inch idea, maybe there's a flex variety that could help with the 60-inch yield increase, a flex variety of corn variety for seed, allowing to capture more sunlight. Maybe there is an economical population for the 60-inch corn. Maybe we can up that, instead of 17,000 seeds per acre, maybe we consider 22,000 seeds on 60-inch rows to take away that $52 an acre difference. 60-inch corn, if that's going to work, it has to be done with cover crops to limit weed pressure and armor the soil for the season. Just a thought, maybe 60-inch corn could be utilized more in a low yielding area. Example, headlands next to a bush for a better return on investment for those lower yielding acres. And then I think the best advantage here is for livestock producers to graze the corn stalk and the cover crops as long into the season as they can. I think that's the best advantage there. One of the other points I had there was at the end of the season, there was less corn fodder residue in the row, so that does play a factor in the spring in a no-till situation where the soil can warm up a lot quicker because there isn't that heavy mat of corn residue there. And also the tar spot issue, we did see nothing, no data driven, but a lot less pressure with the tar spot in the 60-inch rows. I mean, there's lots of work to do there, but just a thought going forward. So thank you.
Thanks, Mike. That's awesome. Next, Adam Hayes. Adam retired from OMAFRA as a soil management specialist in 2019. He has spent some time the last 2+ years doing contract work, helping to coordinate and implement the on-farm project for the Soil Resource Group, assisting with developing soil health training for the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus, as well as a number of soil health videos for farm and food care. When he's not doing that, he enjoys spending time with his 2 grandchildren, doing volunteer work, cycling, woodworking, and several other hobbies. You can see your screen, Adam, and feel free to go ahead.
Okay. Excuse me. Thanks, Jessica. I was asked to talk about the on-farm project and in more specifics a little bit about the spot we have under that program. The on-farm project is funded through the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a federal provincial program, and the on-farm delivery was awarded to the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. The 3 pillars of the on-farm project, there's a water quality component, which is continuing on with the water quality monitoring and modeling that was done in the priority subwatersheds from the Glassy program, and OSCIA contracted a number of conservation authorities to do that work. The soil health component is establishing the paired trials, in-field trials across the province to examine a number of soil health indicators and test the effectiveness of best management practices. And the Soil Resource Group was contracted to do that work. And then the third part is engagement, which is looking at getting stakeholders and farmers together to foster a network of demonstration farms going forward like these into the future to be able to assess long-term benefits of soil health practices. The sites are located, as you can see, the orange dots are the where the subwatershed projects are. So there's 1 in Maitland, 2 in the Asable Bayfield conservation area, 2 with the Upper Thames, 1 in Lower Thames, and 1 in Essex County with the Essex Conservation Authority. For the on-farm part, the soil health part of it, there was 5 regions established. The intent was to spread it across Southern Ontario, so there was good distribution of sites. There's set up 5 regions: Eastern, Central, Western, Lake Erie, East, and West. And those, there's 5 in each of those regions, trying to get a mix of farm operations, as well as trying to hit the dominant soil types in those regions. The Cooperators were, there was a big list of cooperators that were given, and there was a selection process to bring us down to the best sites and the best cooperators for the project. To zero in a bit more on the plots themselves, there's two best management practices that we really focus on. One is cover crops and one is organic amendments. And the organic amendment plots, it's usually a cover crop. It's a cover crop and an organic amendment treatment. And so it would be a check, a cover crop strip, an organic amendment strip, and then the two together in a strip. This is Mike's plot. He wanted to focus just on cover crops. And so this is the layout of the plot. This is one rep. There's 3 reps in his site. On the other sites, there's a range from 1 replication to 3 replications, depending on what worked out for the field and for the farmer. So you can see we established the site at Mike's in 2020. It was in winter wheat. And after the winter wheat, he seeded a 5-way cover crop mix that was drilled in after harvest. There was a check. We added buckwheat to that mix for the 3rd treatment. And then the 4th treatment was setting up biostrips with 2 rows of the 5-way mix and 2 rows left bare. In 2021, we looked at, we were going to look at interseeding, and Mike said, why don't we throw the 60-inch corn into it? So we said, yeah, that'd be a great idea. So it was included in there as treatment 3, and the 1 and 4 were interseeding mixes. The sites are set up with each strip has 3 benchmarks in it. If there's, we try to hit 3 topographies, upper, middle, and lower slope for those. And so we end up with 12 benchmarks in a field layout like this. In 2020, we had a field day at Mike's for the project, and you can see him standing in front of the 5-way plus the buckwheat cover crop mix. And you can see there was pretty good growth from that year. And we did biomass sampling later in October. And there was 3,500 kilograms per hectare in the 5-way mix. Check was 550, which was mostly volunteer wheat, about 2,500 with the buckwheat and 4,700 with the biostrips. It just reinforces the fact that volunteer wheat, can be a cover crop, but you certainly get a lot more biomass from the roots and the above ground with a seeded cover crop. Mike showed you the combine numbers. We did our hand harvest yields were fairly similar and in agreement with what Mike was showing there for the difference. And we did, when we were hand harvesting, we did see a lot of stalks with multiple cobs on it, as Mike was saying. For these plots across the province, we did baseline measurements of a number of soil health indicators. There's some here. We did fertility analysis and sampling, as well as some other ones. And so with the 12 benchmarks, there's a lot of numbers to look at. So I just averaged them for the plot here. And basically what it shows is the excuse me, 30 plus years of good soil management has them showing good organic matter levels. The color coding is red, very low, yellow is moderate, and green is high or very high. And so the organic matter levels are very good. The active carbon numbers were low, but I found that to be a bit of a variable measurement. So sometimes it reflects what I think it should, and other times it doesn't. This case, it showed a bit lower. The Solvita CO2 was a moderate rating. The Solvita labile amino nitrogen was a moderate rating. Potentially mineralizable nitrogen was moderate. That number may be a little bit higher because of the nitrogen that would have been applied early on in the spring, but I think it's probably not too far off. And then the aggregate stability is very good for those soils. Those soil particles stay together very well. So just a reflection of that good management of the no-till, the 3-crop rotation, and the cover crops. Just as comparison, the nearby bush was measured, and you can see, the numbers are all higher for those indicators there. So just some preliminary observations that we've seen from the project so far. With the sites that we have spread across the province, one of the key forms of soil degradation that we're seeing is historic tillage erosion on those sites. Not so much on Mike's site because it's pretty flat, but that's fairly noticeable across our sites. The other typical form is soil compaction, and then in a number of areas, low organic matter on certain areas of fields as well. To a greater degree, of degradation on challenging soil, we're seeing a greater degree of degradation on the challenging soils. So the high clay content or high sand content soils, and on those soils we do see a greater impact on growth and productivity than we do on the loam soils. The baseline soil health indicators that I was showing you there, we do see significant differences in those by soil type and landscape position in a majority of those sites. So just like you would see in fertility variability in a field, we do see that from these soil health indicators there as well. The BMPs that we're looking at, the cover crops and organic amendments, are certainly options that are put out there to fight those types of degradation. And so with these benchmark numbers, and we'll be following up this year to resample those fields in the last year of the project to hopefully, identify some of those changes or improvements from those BMPs that were implemented. And the other thing that we're doing as part of this project is looking at, we're trying to collect economic information on these BMPs. And so we'll look at the cost effectiveness of these BMPs or the suite of them. We'll be doing some analysis on that. If you're looking for more information on the on-farm project, you can go to that website, or if you go to the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association website, there's a link there that shows you a map of the sites and what different, what's being done at each of the different sites. And as we post reports and that information will go up there as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Adam. If you have that link, maybe you could even drop it in the chat.
Sure.
That would be just really easy then. Next up, we have Patrick Verkley, who is a broiler and cash crop farmer in Adelaide Township in Middlesex County. He farms on mostly clay soils, and his family has been no-till farming for at least 25 years. A graduate of Ryerson University, Patrick is keen to push the bounds of how he farms to make it a viable and sustainable operation. We can see your slides, but we can't hear you. There we go.
Am I good there?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
So yeah, only one correction. It was Waterloo, not Ryerson. So 60-inch corn. Why is everyone so excited about losing yield? Yeah, so far everything looks like that, but I thought I'd just run through the plot I'd done this past year. 2021 was my second year playing with it. First year was a really basic. I shut every other row off and continue with normal. And I was playing in some tough spots. So yields were challenging. Anyway, 2021, I kind of got more serious and a bit more specific. So there is a map of the plot layout that I've done this year. One thing to note is I'm doing this plot in the ground beside my chicken barn. So the barn's 3 years old now. The ground's had a bulldozer run over it. Drainage isn't great, but it's a spot that I have to play with that's kind of hard to farm any other ways. So that's, the location's an opportunity for me to play as opposed to, the best spot to check this out. But treatments I had was 32,000 plants per acre, 30-inch control check. And then various treatments playing with 60-inch corn. So I had one at, basically just turn every other row off so you get to 16,000 plants per acre. One where I bumped up the population to 22,000, which is incidentally as high as the planter would allow me to plant anyway. Third treatment was again 16,000, but with less starter. I kind of want to see what that would do. Fourth treatment was wanting to see what does lower population do on 30-inch. So drop the population down to 30, and then just to see what would happen on 60-inch was 8,000 plants per acre. And that was really on that, if you sort of look on the left side of the barn, that's even tougher ground, and that's sort of where I did the really experimental stuff. Thanks to Nick Stockman for letting me borrow his tractor and RTK setup, and yeah, his planter is a lot easier to change settings on than my old John Deere 7000. So anyway, that really helped with able to do replicated stuff, and the RTK was also really quite critical for me anyway on coming back and seeding in those cover crops. So what we ended up doing to seed the cover crops was I sort of took and made some modifications to Nick's Great Plains drill there, so that basically we just lifted up one row over where every 30-inch row of corn would be, and then just follow the same RTK lines. As you can see, I also have some non-seeded cover crops there, otherwise known as weeds. So that's definitely something that I'm going to have to work on, getting down the herbicide program nailed down a bit better in the future. I basically only used Roundup, so I didn't ever put any residual down. I was sort of concerned of what that was going to do to the cover crop seed establishment. However, Nick did have in his plot had a residual down at the beginning and he still got decent cover crop establishment. So I think that's where to go. It's kind of hard to see because took a picture at the end of the row, but there is more cover crop establishment in 60-inch than you've seen in the 30. That was, among other things, that was part of the reason why I was wanting to look at 60s, was a way to get cover crop established into standing corn that wasn't annual ryegrass, because that stuff can be a pain in the where if you don't get it killed perfectly, which I discovered this year. So the other aspect to this was I had a bit of a question of soil rehab. So this the picture, the big picture there on the right, like that's to the west of my barn. And that's like, I got, when I did just conventionally planted corn there last year, like it did like 120 bushel an acre on average. And there's just a lot of rough stuff. So I was looking to see, well, if you got a soil that needs to be rehabbed, like what is the potential to cover crop? And there's a lot of biomass there and growth there, which I thought was just interesting. And like, as much as this, you know, as much as I would like for something else going on. To me, there's also, it really is it's an opportunity for some biodiversity. And, you know, as isn't a surprise to anybody, I think we have this 60-inch corn system with the bio corridors. It is a way to try and incorporate some of the things that the public is looking for agriculture as we are stewards of the land. You know, I think people are starting to get concerned about what monocultures do to our environment, to all the other aspects that live in the ecosystem, that, you know, we don't maybe have an economic value for, but I think are probably important in the long run. So as much as this is, you know, some strategy on maybe there's money making potential from a farming side, I think there's also, you know, this is a way to sort of create the pollinator habitat and do all those other things without having to try and sacrifice a whole lot on the farming side. So that's kind of why I've been playing with this. And lastly, well, so anyway, this is this was combining it. It was a lot easier to combine with corn planted in RTK than it was last year when I tried to hand bomb it and basically had to take off 2 rows at a time, which took a long time. The one issue I had this year was that I had such good cover crop establishment that probably need to make sure that the knives are closer in on the stalk rollers. I talked to the guy who's combine board about that. It's like, oh yeah, we haven't had to deal with that for a long time, but there's a setting there. So I spent about half the time just trying to clean out the stalk rollers, but that's a manageable solution. That's sort of what it looked like afterwards. And as Mike had said, like there's a lot less corn stover biomass to deal with after this. But I also got a fair bit of green cover crop there. So does it excel? What do the numbers have to say? I'm not gonna, this is just the base data, so if you come back and wanna look at it. This is also Nick Stockman's base data, so if we wanna come back, look at it, we can. So I guess pull out some stuff. No doubt about it, there's a significant yield hit that that this took compared to Czech. Yeah, from 118 on my Czech strip to 83 on the best of the 60-inch plots. Interestingly enough, there wasn't a whole, I saw a yield decrease when I bumped it up to 22,000 in row. So I think there's a bunch of that sort of stuff. What I thought was interesting, valuable information from all of this was it's the bushels per 1,000 plants. And so you can kind of see where, you know, on mine, my check was 3.7, whereas that 60-inch 16,000 was up to 5.2. And you'll see, you know, with Nick's there, his check was 7.7 and his 60-inch was 9.7. So like each plant is doing more when it's given more space to grow. It's a question of how do we have to build a system that adjusts to that. There's all my, you know, all the rough economic ones. I don't have in my land costs, because if I did, then I just feel bad about my bad year plot this year. Part of the thing with my plot was it was only 5 acres and I didn't really want to deal with getting a bunch of input costs. So I just tried to rely solely on chicken manure, which wasn't the right solution, but Nick actually fed his crop properly. So, you know, we still have some data there. On a per acre basis, yeah, this year it didn't make any money relative to the 30s. But what I did here at the far right there is, assuming I can get the same bushels per plant that I did in 60s, in the 16,000, if I went to a twin row system at 60-inch rows on center, I get the same bushels per plant in that system, given the edge row effect. I think there's potential for an economic return, but I think that's why. Well, I think that's why all the guys in the States are looking at twin rows, not singles. And I also just looked at that on a per bushel basis. So there's sort of an idea. One thing that did come up was edge row effect, and this is something that is a problem with these small trials, is that I was talking to Peter Harvey yesterday. He does the crazy strips, which are 15 foot wide, and he's seeing corn yield benefits of about 10 to 15% a year on his crazy strips. And the issue is that all of our check strips in a lot of these plots that I've been looking at, they're like 20 foot wide. So I think we're getting some edge row effect. Wanted to see what the potential was for there. Luckily, Nick had some check strips within his just regular 30-inch other farm plots. Now they're a different variety than the one that was in his 60-inch. So it's not an apples, but basically what I did here is I just took the averages of his 60-inch check strip at the 30s, as well as his two 30-inch check strips from the other two, and average those together, which got to 227 bushels per acre as a check instead of the 247. Basically divide that out, you say that's 92%. So I want to see what that looks like. I took 92% of what my check strip was as a way to sort of maybe bring that down to correct for a hypothetical edge row effect in my corn. Instead of 118, it's 109. So there's still a yield loss. It's still not great economics, but when I get down to a per bushel basis, it does tip the balance in favor of say like the 60 inch at 16K. Like then now there's an economic benefit on a per bushel basis, assuming that you before land costs. So there's still lots to work with there. Yeah, so my next steps is going to be looking at, I think we need to go to twin row to get the population up without crowding them to those plants too close together in row, as well as really need to look at that fertility. I keep looking back at the dairy guys, like there's the guys who have more cows, but they'll get their feed costs way down. And then there's the guys who will have less cows, but they don't really care what the feed cost is. And they just get great, excellent production out of those cattle. And those are the ones that seem to be building the nice new barns and having, like, they seem to be doing better despite not worrying about all those other expenses. So I have a suspicion that that's what I have to play with. Next step, I also think, as Mike said, like grazing, luckily I have the luxury, I do have chickens, so I may have to just eat it and like build some chicken tractors and get them rolling inside of these 60-inch, because we need to find a way to make money off of those cover crops, and in order to really see benefit from this opportunity. It's a way to sort of bring the long-term advantage of better soil health, to an economic return this year. And just more conversations. Like this isn't a set deal. This isn't great. I've heard a lot of people talk about 60-inch corn as like the early days of no-till, and I'm quite thankful for the group of people that this whole enterprise of looking at 16 corn has put me in contact. So anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Patrick. I was wondering if you'd bring up the chicken tractors. That was going to be one of my questions, if your next step was to incorporate livestock or chickens um, into your operation, well, into your cover crop aspect. And since you're speaking again later this afternoon, I'll make sure I get the right university. Our last speaker for this session is Ben Rosser, who works as a corn specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs. Ben received his Bachelor and Master of Science in Agronomy from the University of Guelph. Ben enjoys working on applied research projects with Ontario corn growers and works out of the Crop Science Building at the University of Guelph.
Thanks, Jessica. You can see and hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Awesome, thanks. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about 60-inch corn and what data we've gathered in Ontario. Slides will progress. There we go. So it's already been talked about a little bit, but you know, the interest in 60-inch corn, you know, obviously there's interest in trying to get cover crops to establish in corn, even if they're not there in season, have something there at the end of the season, maybe for cover between the rows. There's been a bunch of work trying to look at interseeding 30-inch rows, but there's been a real struggle trying to get things to establish. So obviously there's interest in maybe trying to widen rows out to get better luck in establishing cover crops. So the first time I was asked about it was a couple years ago. There was a number of articles in some of the popular press down in the US about Bob Recker. So Bob is in Waterloo, Iowa. So about similar latitude as Chatham. And so, you know, Bob was interested in the same thing and he wanted to play around with it. I think naturally, if you said 60-inch rows, you know, we spent the last 50 years trying to narrow rows in North America. So obviously, the first thing if you talk about is trying to widen rows out, especially to 60 inches, you know, the first thing is, well, you know, what's the yield impact of that going to be? But in some of this work that Bob had done and had been written up about, in his experiences, he was able to widen those rows out to 60 inches and have yields that didn't drag compared to his 30-inch rows. So of course, that gets you thinking, well, I mean, if you can do that, then maybe it would be a no-brainer. But of course, it's something I think that needs to be tested and played around with a bit. So, you know, what have others found or other jurisdictions that have played around with it? So I think the biggest data set I was able to find was from Practical Farmers of Iowa. They had done, I think it was 5 trials across 2 years, or 10 trials in total, 5 in 2018 and 5 in 2019. And when they summarized their results, out of the 10 trials, 4 of them had yields where there was no yield drag for the 60-inch rows. But there was yield drag in 6 other trials. So it seems like there is some potential, or at least some locations are able to go to 60 inches without a major yield lag. But obviously there is still some risk out there if you're going to 60-inch rows based on the work that's been done in Iowa. And I know, of course, when it comes down to cover crops, they didn't include a number here in their summary, but they did say that, you know, with the 60-inch rows, they were able to create or grow substantially more cover crop in those rows than what they could with the 30-inch. They had some numbers too in other areas. You know, in some fields it was 25 times the amount of cover crop and things like that. So certainly it seemed like the merits are there in 60-inch rows, trying to get more cover crop growth, as Patrick and Mike have both shown as well. But I think there still is the question of what is the yield risk in trying to go to that system. Evidently, there's some locations, at least in Iowa, where they could make it work without a lot of risk. But clearly there's fields as well where there is risk and yield loss. So could you try to figure out what's going on there and how to limit those risks? So there's been a number of comparisons done in the province here the last couple of years, given there's been a fair bit of talk about it. So I want to quickly go over some of the challenges of trying to test 60-inch corn rows on farm real quick before we go into those results. And again, some of those have been talked about already. I think the first one was, you know, particularly if you're using a ground drive planter, trying to get equal populations between a 30-inch row and a 60-inch row can be a bit of a challenge. So a number of trials that have been done, they've simply shut off the rows and done half rate populations in the rows that were kept on. And I think part of the challenge is you might not have the gear settings to get to you know, a plant per acre. Obviously, if you're shutting half your rows off, you need to be twice as many plants per foot of row in those corn rows, and you might not have those options on a ground drive planter. Some growers have tried to get around that. In Ontario, there's some that have done twin rows, or I'm going to call them pseudo twin rows, where they're still planting at the same half rate they're doing in 60 inches, but they're using RTK to manually make a twin row without a twin row planter to try to look at that or try to get the population out of that. So, if you don't have hydraulic drive or anything like that where you can adjust them, that's maybe an option you could play around with if you've got the GPS that will let you to do that. I think another option or another issue, and Patrick had some good numbers on this, was the edge row effect. So, how much, if you're trying to compare things and you're not able just to take a swipe out of the middle of those plots to avoid edge row effect. Some growers have been able to do that, but not everybody can, depending on space and equipment widths and all that sort of thing. So, what is the yield gain on those edge rows for your 30-inch rows if you've got a 60-inch gap on the side? And try to put some numbers to it. This was a field where we had a 60-inch gap. This wasn't any 60-inch plots or anything. It was a row unit issue going on in a field, and we were doing some other stuff. But I at least did have some data to see what is the edge row effect of a 60-inch row in a 30-inch field. So we did go and hand harvest. We went 2 or 3 rows in from the edge to try to get an idea of, in a 30-inch field, what's the typical yield for this field. And then we also hand harvested the edge. So I guess this is the skill testing question part of my presentation. If you had to guess, what do you think the yield was on that outside edge row? Again, 3 rows in, our average yield in this field was 240. But if you had to guess, what do you think the yield was on that edge row? I have no prizes, unfortunately, but I don't know if you have a guess, if you can put it in the chat. 280, Mike says. 260, Patrick. Earl says Colin says 242. So no edge row effect in this field. So I was pretty surprised when we got the number here. There's one more guess. I can't get it back up. There we go. 290. So yeah, I was surprised when we did the math and we pulled those swipes. The edge rows in this field, and this is 8 replications. So hand harvest, there's more variability, might be an issue, but we did 8 replications. So that should give you a reasonable idea, at least in this part. Those edge rows are 303 bushels an acre on average. So compared to your 30-inch rows not bordered by a 60-inch gap, we had a 60 bushel increase in those rows, or about a 25% yield increase for those edge rows. So clearly, if you're not accounting for that in a field, that is going to have an impact on you. So if you try to do some quick math using those same numbers, if you have a 6-row plot and on average your replicates have one edge that is bordering a 60-inch row, for your 30-inch plots, you're going to inflate yields about 4% for a 6-row plot, maybe about 3% for an 8-row, and maybe around 2% if you're doing 12-row plots, and you've got one side that's bordered by 60-inch. So obviously that's a bit of a challenge if you're not able to take a swipe out of the middle of those plots. And then the last thing, something that's been brought up as well, is starter fertilizer. So if you're going down to 60-inch rows and you've only got half the rows, do you increase your rate of starter fertilizer because you have more plants there? Maybe your whole yield in that row isn't going up double, but how do you manage that? So again, especially if you're on responsive soils, just some things to think about that might be challenging, trying to make a completely fair comparison between 30-inch rows and 60-inch rows. So I've tried to pull together as much data as I've been able to get from the province. So a number of farm cooperators, we've played around with it a little bit ourselves as well. And I've kind of separated into 2 groups. So the very first group was fields where the population in the 60-inch rows wasn't able to be brought up to the same population in the 30-inch rows. So we can't necessarily say in those fields it's purely a 30-inch versus 60-inch comparison, but it's comparing the system of a normal population in a 30-inch row to half the population in a 60-inch row. So we can still make that comparison, I think. And when we look at those, these are the yield responses to the 60-inch rows with half the population of a 30-inch. So you can see we've ranged from a 90 bushel yield hit on the far left-hand side, about a -50 on average for the middle field, and then a little under 40, somewhere between 30 and 40 bushel yield hit for the field on the right-hand side. And there's 2 bars on the right-hand side. That was just because that grower had looked at both 16,000 in the 60-inch corn rows, as well as 22,000, which was the highest population they were able to get up to. So again, clearly there's some yield loss there. I think part of that, like Patrick mentioned, could be inflated because a couple of these fields, there was edge row effect on the 30-inch rows. They weren't able to avoid those edge rows, so that might have been inflated a little bit. And then same thing with the 60s. Some of those 60-inch rows were right up next to a 30-inch plot, so that maybe pulled those yields down a little bit more than what you would have been if you had avoided those. So those yield drags might be a little bit more than if some of those edge row effects have been avoided. But to give an idea, you know, clearly across those 3 sites, there was definitely a yield hit for the 30 versus 60 inches. So I've got 3 more trials here as well that in these trials, the 30-inch and 60 inches were all compared at the same populations. So these would be a fairly fair comparison between 30 and 60s, where population really isn't playing into the effect. And here again, yield lags, maybe not quite as much, but you can see, you know, anywhere from a couple bushels on the far right-hand side to maybe somewhere between 20 and 40 bushels to the left-hand side. So one thing when we've been playing around and questions I've had from others is, you know, what's the right population of corn to plant if you're going to 60-inch rows? Again, I think coming back to the fact that we're jamming a lot more plants per foot of row, if you're going to put the same population out as a 30-inch row, what is the right population? Does the optimum population change, and does that have an impact on what the results will be? So one trial we did at the Perth Demo Farm 2 years ago, I guess, 2020, we did make the comparisons between 30-inch and 60-inch rows at 3 different populations to try to look at that. So we looked at 16,000 plants per acre, or 16,000 seeds per acre, 24,000 seeds per acre, and 32,000 seeds per acre, just to see if those different populations would impact what the response was to those 60-inch rows. And at least, you know, it's just one trial in 1 year, but in that one trial, changing population, again, trying to go to a low population to see if that increases a 60-inch yield because you're putting less plants per foot of row, didn't seem to make a big difference in what the yield response was for the 30s versus 60s. So whether we planted 32,000 or whether even if we went down to 16,000 seeds per acre, the yield drag for those 60-inch rows was pretty consistent at that location. So at least at the Perth Demo Farm in 2020, lowering populations didn't seem to reduce the yield drag of those 60-inch rows. So I think a couple practical challenges, and again, these have been mentioned by the other speakers as well. This is a shot from the Perth Demo Farm in 2020. I didn't plant any cover crops in there. My key goal, at least as a starting point, was just to look at 30 versus 60-inch rows. And the field had a normal fertility program, so there was a herbicide had gone down early, and we had made an in-season herbicide pass as well. So I think, you know, outside of the 60-inch rows, the field was clean, but certainly in those 60-inch plots, there was struggles keeping the weeds down with the extra space and sunlight and that sort of thing in those 60-inch rows. So again, not to say that couldn't be changed, maybe a different herbicide program, but certainly if it's something you're not thinking about coming from 30-inch rows or using a normal 30-inch strategy, there were some issues there. Again, if we had put cover crops in, maybe that would have been less of a challenge if we had suppressed some of the weed growth with cover crops, but not thinking about that, or maybe if you don't have good aggressive cover crops, that could be more of an issue going to the 60-inch rows as well. The other thing was kind of interesting. So again, this is a picture of Perth Demo Farm in 2020. It was really dry there up until about the end of June, and the moisture stress in those 60-inch rows was a lot more evident than what it was in the 30-inch rows. Again, I think, you know, we're putting more plants in per foot of row. So if I had to guess, I'm guessing you just got a lot more transpiration from those plants in a smaller area. So maybe if you're into droughty conditions, that could be a bit more of a risk in a 60-inch system if you're trying to maintain the same population as what you would plant in a 30-inch row. So I guess, you know, some ideas of going forward is how to try to minimize yield loss. You know, one thought I think on population, we didn't have the good side-by-sides of low populations and high populations in all cases for the 60-inch rows, but I think there was a general trend that if the population in those 60-inch rows wasn't brought up to something similar to a 30, it did seem like there was a bit of a more of a trend for more yield losses. Now, it could have just been those fields or sites or something else going on as well, but there did maybe seem to be a trend there. So it seems like maybe there is a need to try to keep populations higher in those 60-inch rows potentially. I guess the other thought again, and has been brought up too, is trying to minimize that yield loss for going to 60-inch rows. Is could you do a twin 60? So this was one trial from a grower near Tavistock where they had didn't have a twin row planter, but they had tried to do some pseudo twin rows by having their seeding rate, and then just doing 2 passes nudged a little bit over with the GPS. So this is a shot. They weren't quite true twin rows in the fact that 7.5 inches apart like you would with a traditional twin row planter. He was a little bit wider than that. But clearly with that system, he was able to get really good cover crop growth in between those wide rows. And if I go back really quick, he was the one grower in this data set that had the less yield loss for his 30 versus 60-inch rows. So that was the trial on the far right-hand side, where his yield losses between his 30s and his twin 60s was only about 3 to 5 bushels per acre. And I should make the comment too, the other trial of another grower who also did twin rows, comparing 30s and 60s, was the one on the second right-hand side. So the 2 trials with the less amount of yield loss in this data set were the 2 growers who had done twin rows with their 60-inch centers. So maybe going forwards, that would be something to look at to do that as well. And the last comment, again, Mike had commented on this as well, is, are there hybrids out there that could do better? Obviously, there's some locations that seem to have less yield loss than others. There was the one trial here, and then there was a number in Iowa as well. Other hybrids that maybe can just handle those wide rows better than others. Of course, there's always a classic challenge of trying to find those hybrids. By the time you figure it out, they might not be around the marketplace much longer, and sometimes trying to find a hybrid that's stable across environments can be a challenge too. But maybe one more question to try to look at to get the most out of a wide row system for improving cover crop establishment. So I guess final comments. If you're thinking of it purely from an agronomic or economic perspective, you're not thinking about soil health or cover crops or anything like that. I think right now, looking at this data, not figuring out more about the system, it seems like there's potentially a lot of risk there for limited gain. If you're thinking, again, just purely from an agronomic or economic perspective. But if you think about it from the value that you could get out of it, if can a 60-inch cover crop produce more definitive value above any lost yield or residue risk, especially if you could narrow that yield gap up a bit. So like Mike had talked about, is there value you can get out of that cover crop from grazing that would offset any yield loss risk? Do the benefits of those cover crops in between rows offset yield losses or potentially a little bit less residue as well? If you're getting soil cover or potentially nutrient retention or better cycling between crops or organic matter. Again, I don't know those numbers. I don't have numbers. That's maybe something to be looked at, but that would be a question. Then the last thing is from a crop marketability perspective. So there has been talk about from some end users about either offering premiums for corn that's produced through reduced carbon methods or methods that are lighter on the environment, potentially, which could be done with this system. Or in some cases, some have also talked about imposing these as contract stipulations. If you're going to deliver, this corn has to be grown using these standards. So if there's maybe an incentive from an end user perspective to offer value for these as well, that would maybe change or tip the scales a little bit too. So I don't know, just some things to think about. But yeah, that's it. So thanks to the audience, and thanks again to all the growers in Ontario who were willing to share their data to all pull together in this data set as well. And with that, that's it for me.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks all of our first round speakers. You guys got that in right in an hour. That's awesome. We have a few minutes for questions. I made sure we made some space. Don McCabe has a question in the chat. Extrapolating out the native site values for the soil health indicators gives a great picture for future opportunities in organic matter, but what will soluble N values end up doing to water quality when Environment Canada is proposing a 30% cut in nitrogen emissions? How do these concepts work together? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Still trying to understand what Don's question is, but
If Dawn wants to ask it, or if there's another question in the interim.
If you don't, I've unmuted myself. I don't know
Yep.
if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
The point of my question is one of questioning why Environment Canada is looking for a reduction in nitrogen emissions without understanding we're trying to run a soil system here. And I think it's very appropriate to compare ourselves to native soils. And my point being, if we're going to be able to get our organic matter back up and do what's right in that area, we're going to need to put nitrogen into the ground to get there. And therefore, their current drive to reduce nitrogen, I think, is a very ill-advised policy decision. And therefore, I'm more looking at just trying to send the message through that they better take a breath here on some of their demands because it's pretty easy to make that statement to reduce our nitrogen. But on the same token, what's this going to do to the rest of the system when it comes to water quality with nitrogen? What's it going to do to the phosphorus if we're not tying up nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, everything else starts falling out of balance too. So that's where my question is headed for. It's not to attack the farming community.
so I think what I found with the 60-inch was like part of the thing that I'd seen to really tick me, push me over to actually trying it was Sebastian Angers in Quebec, and he was doing it as much for the benefits of 60-inch corn. It was probably more so that it allowed him the space to grow a nitrogen producing cover crop for his next year of corn. It's right now we kind of have cheap nitrogen. And in comparison to what it costs to grow the nitrogen on our own ground. And so there's potential that 60-inch corn makes a lot more sense if nitrogen prices keep rising relative to what they are. But the problem is that it's not dependable. We don't really know exactly how much N's going to be there next year. There's a lot of challenges right there. And I think that's maybe the message to Environment Canada is like, yeah, we think there are technologies out there, systems of doing this that maybe we can get our nitrogen, our fossil fuel nitrogen usage down, but like they are not consistent yet. Like if you say we have to do this, then we're gonna, we might really screw over our food system even more than we have just with supply chain issues of COVID. So
We will leave it there to keep it on time. Thank you again, Patrick, Ben, Adam, and Mike.